Right. Thank you very much for the introduction, Ivan. It is my honor today to share my thoughts on cybersecurity. And in particular, we will also talk about human being the weakest link and what we could potentially do to fight against potential attacks. Um, Let me move my slides. My name is Debin. I'm a faculty member from Singapore Management University. And the outline of my talk over here is we're going to cover three main topics today. We will first talk about networking a little bit. So in specific, we talk about internet protocols and their corresponding weaknesses. So that is the first part on more networking. We will then move on to talk about software vulnerability a little bit. So we cover network, we cover software, and then finally, we will briefly talk about human being the weakest link. I hope everybody has your lunch ready, and then you can enjoy the talk while you are having your food. All right. Okay. Internet protocols and its weaknesses. This is my plan for the first part of the talk. I will first talk about the Internet Protocol, so-called IP. I guess many of you may have heard about IP protocol. I'll also briefly talk about the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, right, which is also very essential to ensure the communication on the internet. And after that, I will briefly summarize as to what we can do with these insecure protocols that we have. And finally, also share a little bit about the denial of service attacks and the corresponding vulnerability, and the corresponding evolutions on the denial of service attacks. Right, so that's the plan for part one. So what is Internet Protocol? We have heard about Internet Protocol. The high-level motivation of proposing such a protocol is to enable all the different devices on the internet to be able to talk to each other. So although the devices that we use are different, right? We have our mobile phone, we have our computers, or we have all these IoT devices nowadays. But we hope that we can allow them to talk in exactly the same way, right? So that's the purpose of introducing this IP protocol. Now, the IP protocol was introduced many years ago, and I will briefly share about some of the so-called IP headers here. Now, don't worry too much. It's not my intention to go into technical details of here. So I'll use some analogy to explain the design of such a protocol, so-called the IP datagram or IP protocol format. So the most important thing you want to see from this particular slide is that every packet that we send on the internet has this so-called source IP address and destination IP address. Now, what are they? We can think about a letter that we sent out to be posted in Singapore, for example. Right? You want to put your letter inside an envelope, and you need to address the recipient on your envelope. So that is so-called the destination address that you have to specify. Now, we know that we need to have the destination address specified correctly in order to ensure that this letter or this packet on the internet can be delivered successfully. Now, there is this source IP address as well. Very similarly, on our envelope, typically, we would also indicate our sender's address. But we also understand that even if we do not put the sender's address, quite likely our letters could get delivered successfully within Singapore or even going overseas. Now, interestingly, the same actually holds for the IP protocol on the internet right now. In other words, everybody would need to put the destination IP address correctly in order for the packet to be delivered. But source IP address is a mandatory field, but there's no security feature for us to verify that this source IP address is actually correct or potentially being forged by the attacker. Right? So in this case, this IP protocol and the way it works with this source and this destination IP address is very similar to how the letters are being posted within Singapore, for example. So now if you think from the perspective of the attacker, what would they do with such a protocol being used widely on the internet, right? Now, of course, the good guys will do the proper things, right? So sender machine, they are supposed to follow exactly what this protocol is and set the correct source and destination IP addresses. And the job is typically done by modern operating systems, again, in the correct way, right? And all the applications will do according to this protocol specification. However, if the attackers create an application, and in particular, if the application is running with higher privileges on their machines, then what they can do is they could violate from this particular protocol. They could decide, for example, they could decide to put in some arbitrary numbers in this source IP address. So it can be random, or it can be sometimes so-called unused IP address, so that nobody can trace back as to, hey, who is the guy who actually sent out this particular packet, right? So that is what is widely believed or widely called as forging the source IP address. Now, typically, the attackers do not forge the destination IP address, though, and I guess you can take a guess as to why, right? Again, very similar to how our letters are being posted. If they set the destination IP address wrongly, then the packet would not get successfully delivered to the intended recipient. So that's why usually what the attackers would do is to forge the source IP address only. Now, with this insecure property of the IP protocol that we are using every day, what are the potential security threats that we are facing here, right? The attackers can perform the so-called denial of service attack, which I will explain a little bit more later on, right? But basically what the attacker can do is they can send out tons of packets to try to overwhelm a potential victim. And the problem we have right now is that these tons of packets being sent by the attacker do not have the correct source IP address being set. So even if we manage to detect such denial of service attacks happening, it will be very, very difficult for us to trace back to who the sender is. Right. So that is one potential consequence. I mentioned already just now, IP being spoofed, right? So by examining these packets on the internet and by analyzing the source IP address, usually we would actually get wrong information, and that would not really reveal the sender's identity. And of course, the attackers can do even more than that, right? So they can use different hacking techniques or scripts to automate this process. And by sending out all these different packets to many different hosts on the internet, they can even find out our host configurations. So for example, by examining these replies from our machines, the attackers can figure out what operating systems we are running. They can figure out what software that is being executed on our machines as well. So these are the things that the attackers could potentially do with such a insecure IP protocol that we have. All right, so this is the first example that I wish to provide is on the IP protocol. Let me move on to the second protocol that I want to briefly demonstrate, which is called the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP protocol. Just now we used the analogy of sending a letter as an end user. Now we can think about, okay, after the letter has been posted, our post office would have to find a way of delivering this letter to the intended recipient. And that delivery could happen not just within Singapore, but also with the cooperation from other countries as well. So here, the Border Gateway Protocol is trying to achieve some similar functionality. So first of all, let me explain what these so-called AS autonomous systems are. The analogy is they are the post offices, right? So these are the post offices of Singapore or of any other countries. So autonomous systems are typically those very big players on the internet. Here I'm providing with you a couple of examples, right? MIT has a particular autonomous system and so-called AS number. Singapore government also has a particular AS number assigned because these are relatively big players on the internet. Now, these big players would also need to play a role in helping our end users to deliver their corresponding packets on the internet. So they will have to work with each other. They will have to exchange information among each other in order to ensure that this delivery of the packets can be happening correctly and in a reliable manner. So you can imagine that on the internet, there are many these kind of big players, these kind of autonomous systems, and they are very well connected. I'm here showing a very connected graph showing you that there are many autonomous systems on the internet, and they are very well connected. Now, question is, how do they work together in order to ensure packet delivery? I'm here showing you on the left-hand side a graph or a illustration to see how normally it works. So this is the case where there is no attack, and if every autonomous systems on the internet are well behaved. So you can take a look at this very simple diagram. We imagine in this case there are 7 big players on the internet, right? So AS number 1 all the way to AS number 7. And let's take a moment to imagine that we are one of the users in this AS number 6. So let's say AS number 6 is actually Singtel or M1 or StarHub. So one of the internet service providers. Now, in order for our internet service providers to help us to deliver the packet to the right destination, our internet service providers would have to send the so-called BGP update messages to their neighbors or their peers on the internet. So for example, Singtel in this case sends this particular update message to our neighboring country, let's say ISP in Malaysia, and telling this AS number 5 that, hey, my very good neighbor, here I'm trying to tell you that these range of IP addresses are actually belonging to my customers, and I'm helping them to send out packets on the internet. So later on, if you see any packets on the internet whose destination IP address belongs to this range, please send it to me. Because again, they are my customers. So I own this particular IP address. So this is a BGP update message to tell our neighboring AS number 5. AS number 5 received that particular BGP update message and will further forward it to its onward neighbors. In this case, AS number 4 and AS number 7. Right. So after a number of forwarding of these kind of messages, you can imagine that everybody on the internet understands that, hey, this particular IP address range belongs to Singtel, belongs to this particular customer of Singtel. And if there is any other packets on the internet whose destination IP address belongs to that range, everybody on the internet will help forwarding those packets over to AS4 and then forward to AS number 5, and then finally sending to AS number 6 and get delivered to the intended recipient. So that is the way it's supposed to work on the internet with this very powerful protocol called BGP, Border Gateway Protocol. Right, so this is a very good design, and things works well very correctly if everybody is behaving. But now we understand that on the internet there could be potentially people who are not behaving, and sometimes it's not that they are intentionally trying to do harm, but potentially there could be misconfigurations on these ASs as well. So now I'm going to show you another graph. All right, so the right-hand side here, which is indicating a potential attack starting from AS number 1. So in this case, AS number 1, it could be another ISP at the other side of the globe, right? Due to either intentional attack or due to misconfigurations, let's imagine that this AS1 sends out a very similar BGP update message, claiming that AS1 is the owner of the same IP address range. And at this point in time, when AS2 receives such an update message, he will believe that AS1 is doing the right thing and just continue forwarding that update message over to AS3 and subsequently to AS4 and 7, etc. So within a few seconds or a couple of minutes, this message will be accepted by everybody on the internet. And you can see what potentially could go wrong, right? So now, if there's anyone who wants to send a packet over to me, again, let's assume that I'm a customer of Singtel, S6. The players on the internet wouldn't know that. They believe AS1, and they will actually forward those packets over to AS1. and eventually leading to packet being lost and not successfully being delivered to the intended recipient. So that is a problem of our border gateway protocol. And again, in fact, IP protocol that I mentioned earlier and this border gateway protocol are being used on the internet right now, every single moment, including the packet that you're receiving from this Zoom session right now. Okay, so that is the big problem of this BGP security protocol. Have we ever had security incidents because of that? The answer is yes. I'm listing one of them, which is one of the most famous prior incident that we have on BGP protocol. So in 1997, the entire internet was down for 2 hours because of these relatively small internet service providers at Virginia. They sent out a wrong BGP update message claiming that they are the owner of every single IP address on the internet. So because of that, all the ISPs on the internet, they forward every single packet over to this particular ISP, thinking that they are the intended recipient over there. So that leads to the internet being stopped for almost 2 hours. We also have it happen pretty near us, right? So 2015, very similar incident happened to Telecom Malaysia, leading to also a internet outage for about 2 hours. Now, this one is not as severe as the previous one in the sense that Telecom Malaysia did not send out packets claiming that they are the owner of every single IP address, but a pretty big range of IP address. So that still leads to a similar incident where the internet in the region within Southeast Asia was very severely being affected for 2 hours. So these are some of the incidents that had happened and incidents near us. Now, what kind of damages could this lead to? Here, I'm listing quite a number of them. I don't think I want to go through every single one, but you can imagine that this could lead to, for example, diverting traffic to a particular sink. So the attacker can inject some malicious BGP update message on the internet, leading to certain particular IP address range being diverted to a particular destination. It could also lead to routing loops, for example, or even like part of the internet being cut off from the entire network. So these are some of the potential damages that could happen. Okay, so I have spent like 10, 15 minutes talking about these two different protocols. And in fact, these are just two of the most representative ones. There are many other protocols on the internet right now that are being proposed many years ago without security concerns in mind. And they are continued being used every day on the internet. So I guess there will be a natural question that you may be having now. So, hey, if we have these insecure protocols on the internet right now, can we simply remove them? Or can we replace them or update them? Since we are well aware of the potential damages that they can create. Now, this is something that we wish we can do, and many researchers around the world are putting a lot of effort to this particular direction. Unfortunately, it is very hard for us to do so. The main reason is because internet is now being used by so many users. So very hard due to the huge number of users using these protocols right now. And in cases where it is possible, we need so-called incremental deployment. It is not possible for us to tell everybody in the world saying that, hey, let us shut down the internet for a few moments so that we can replace all the protocols being used. So all we can potentially do is to do it so-called incrementally, right? So slowly, we can patch up these protocols being implemented on every single machine. But definitely that is not going to happen overnight, and it will take a long time for us to roll out these updates. So with this, and I wish that I can emphasize this very important concept called security by design, because we are actually learning all these mistakes, and we are suffering from all these mistakes that we have made in the past. So in the future, when we are proposing new systems, we wish to really have security as a main consideration at the very beginning. And that is what we call security by design. Okay, so hopefully now we understand that we are living with these insecure protocols, and we cannot very quickly replace or update these protocols. So let's talk about what the attackers are doing nowadays then. Okay, so they are taking advantage of these insecure protocols. And one of the main thing that they do nowadays on the internet is so-called these denial of service attacks. So what is denial of service attack? What is DOS attack? Right. So in general, what the attackers doing is trying to overwhelm the victims to the extent of unresponsiveness. So for example, the attackers can try to overwhelm a particular web server to the extent that the web server would not be able to respond or handle the legitimate client's requests. So this can be done by causing the system to crash, to hang, or to behave in an unpredictable manner. Um, the denial of service attacks on the internet has already been happening for a number of years, and there has been certain evolution to the techniques that the attackers use. So, for example, they initially perform this in a point-to-point manner, so only one attacker and one potential victim. And then it advances to this so-called one-to-many to one attack. So there's one attacker, right, but he's actually engaging many intermediate nodes in order to send all these packets to one single victim. And then there's many to one, and there's many to many attack. And eventually, right now, the most commonly seen denial of service attacks on the internet is so-called the distributed denial of service attack. And how does it work? It works something like the following in this particular slide. So there's one single attacker potentially. This single attacker could be engaging a few agents, so-called, on the internet. And these agents will then engage a number of so-called zombie or bot on the botnets on the internet. Now, let me make it very clear that these zombies or even potential agents, they may not be the intent, they may not have any intention to perform the attack. They could be simply machines with some software vulnerability that are being compromised by the attacker. And the attackers can now control these machines to further send out all these denial of service attack packets over to the potential victim. So you can see that at this point in time, then the victim could be receiving many, many packets at the same time from many machines all around the internet. And it is potentially possible that an internet server can be taken down within seconds by distributed denial of service attacks. Now, here I'm trying to give you one example to see how creative these attackers are when they are trying to exploit some vulnerabilities or some weaknesses on our web servers. And this is probably one of the most famous kind of attacks that the attackers are doing, which is called scene flooding. So let me show you how this very creative attack works. Here I'm showing you one particular bad guy called Steve, right? And then there's one victim server on the internet. So what this bad guy is doing is he's sending a particular request to the victim. In this case, doesn't have to be a lot of this kind of requests. But basically the request says that, hey, my name is Mark, and you know why it is called Mark, right? Not Steve. Steve is the actual real name. Mark is a forged IP address. I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk, that the IP address, the source IP address can easily be forged. So this bad guy, Steve, sent this particular packet over to the victim, claiming that he's Mark, and just saying that, hey, I have some requests. I want to talk to you. Now, what does the victim do? Victim being a very nice guy, all right, being a very well-behaved web server, he would actually allocate some resources, trying to be able to serve this particular client in the next few minutes or in the next few seconds. So the victim actually set aside certain resources for this particular client, right? But the problem is that this is actually not a real client, right? This client is not really intending to send real requests. So when the victim server send back a reply to this particular client, And that's why you can see that the arrow goes to a different direction because the source IP address has already been forged. So the victim actually sends the response to somewhere on the internet, but not the actual attacker in this case. And the server says, okay, good, I'm ready to talk to you, and I have already allocated certain resources, and I'm waiting for your further reply. But in this case, the attacker is actually not going to respond, not going to provide any further response. But the victim is there hanging with the resources allocated already, waiting to continue talking to this client. And this client can send not just one request, he can send, in this case, I'm indicating 10,000 requests in 1 second. And of course, in the distributed enough service attack, he can actually engage all the different zombies to continue sending out these requests at the same time. So the poor victim, in this case, allocates more and more resources just to be ready to serve these potential attackers. And because of all these resources being allocated, the victim server may no longer be able to respond to the legitimate, the real clients on the internet. Right, so this is so-called the SYN flooding attack that is very well known, and it is commonly being used by many of the attackers to launch the distributed denial service attack. Okay, so with that, let me just also briefly talk about the past denial service attacks. You may have heard about some of these actually. So for example, in 2016, StarHub was actually suffering from this distributed denial service attack for a service breakdown for 2 hours to their broadband service providers. And this is the result of some StarHub machines. And in fact, these are not real, doesn't have to be computers. They could be the modems or the routers being deployed by StarHub network. And the attackers actually compromise some of these devices on the internet that are StarHub users and launch a distributed denial service attack on the DNS server of StarHub. And that leads to more than 2 hours of outage of the broadband services provided by StarHub. So this is one previous incident that we have due to distributed denial service attack. Okay, I have spent like 25 minutes talking about networking so far. So just a very quick recap. We talk about a couple of internet protocols that are not secure. And the attackers could potentially take advantage of these weaknesses on our protocol to perform distributed denial service attacks. Unfortunately, we don't have a easy way to fix all these things. The reason is because the internet is so big, being used by so many people right now, and there's no way we can overnight patch all these vulnerable protocols. So having talked about this protocol or the problems or the weaknesses in the protocols or the networking issues, let's now very briefly move on to talk about software vulnerabilities as well. Right? We have heard about software vulnerabilities. We have heard about how attackers exploit the vulnerabilities to do interesting things. But you may be wondering as to, hey, why is that happening, and how could that potentially happen when we have very good programmers out there doing or implementing all this software? So here I'm trying to give you one simple example to illustrate how this could potentially happen. And this particular one that I want to briefly talk about is so-called the buffer overflow attack. Again, this is one of the very well-known software vulnerabilities out there on the internet. Some researchers have been saying that it accounts for more than 50% of all the software vulnerabilities that we have nowadays. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So when we say buffer overflow, what do we mean by that? What is a buffer? Well, buffer, very simple, is just a block of memory. You can imagine that on our computer, we need to reserve some memory for many different purposes. To store some data, for example, you can think about a banking application, let's say. Every bank, their software needs to reserve some memory to store, let's say, our IC number, our account balance, our account type, our account history, etc., etc. So this is so-called a buffer being used on our computer to store certain information. Now, what do we mean by overflowing? Overflowing means that if we are either reading or writing more than what was allocated. Another example, right? So we were still talking about this banking application, let's say. Let's say the banking application reserves certain amount of memory storage to store our name and account balance. But what if we potentially are reading or writing more than what was initially allocated? That would lead to so-called this buffer overflow. And what could this potentially happen? Um, don't worry, I know you may not want to look at source code. You may not want to look at the details of these software implementations. So here I'm just using a very simple example. So in this very simple example, let's assume that this bank, right, this bank XYZ is implementing this very simple software to store our account information. In this case, if you look at the third line of this source code, he's allocating 8 bytes, 8 characters to store our name, and then followed by an unsigned integer to store our account balance and the account type. Let's say the type is to specify whether this is a savings account or a checking account. So this is the very simple coding that is at the back end of this particular bank ABZ. All right. Now, what do we mean by buffer and buffer overflow? In this particular case, the buffer that I'm talking is these 8 characters allocated to store our name. For whatever reason, this bank believes that, hey, 8 characters would be sufficient to store the name of our customers. But you can easily imagine that there are people whose name is actually going beyond 8 characters, right? So when this particular banking application is being used in practice, a banking clerk may be entering more than 8 characters into the name, the field for this particular account. And then what happened? The last few characters of this particular name would get overflown because the storage reserve is actually not sufficient to hold more than 8 characters. And these additional characters will actually go overflowing into what I think you can actually imagine. It actually overflows into the data right next to it. In this particular case, it's the account balance. So the information about the name now gets overflowing and gets overwriting into the memory storage that is used to store our account balance. So that means it results into our account balance being overwritten, being modified. Now, if this is an unintended way of using it, then it potentially could lead to program crashing, right, or misbehaving. But if the attacker is constructing a very well-crafted name, it can even lead to the account balance being overwritten or being modified into a specific value. So that is a simple example of this kind of buffer overflow, which happens all the time in our software nowadays. So here is an example of the banking application with the customer's name, and it fails to check the length of the name before it is being copied into the program, and that leads to the account balance being overwritten by this software vulnerability. So this is the example that I'm going to use for today, hopefully to give you some idea that these kind of errors or vulnerabilities can happen very easily, and it can be very easily being overlooked by the software developer or the one that is using this particular software. Now, how bad can this be? What kind of damages can this lead to? Right. So we have seen one damage just now, right, where the account balance is overwritten, being modified. And you can imagine many kind of other kind of data can get overwritten as well. So for example, our effective user ID can be overwritten, can be changed, right? Initially, we are a so-called unprivileged user, but due to this buffer overflow, our account could become a privileged user. So the attacker can potentially do this to gain some additional privileges on our computing system. You can also change the, let's say, motor spinning speed, right? So you can imagine that inside the memory, this particular storage is to store how fast our motor is supposed to spin. But if the attacker can override that data, he can make our engine spin much faster, leading to potential physical damage to our systems as well. So this is so-called the non-control flow exploits. The attacker can also exploit control flow, meaning that he can even make his own code being executing on our computing system. So this could be some of the bad things. Again, we had some past software exploitation and potential incidents as well. I'm sure you have heard about, for example, the SingHealth data breach. The mean death data breach happened in 2017. Straits Time being hacked in 2013. Most of these are partially, at least, due to the software vulnerabilities that we have on our computing system and the attacker taking advantage of that. All right, so that would conclude the second part of my talk, which is to briefly talk about the software vulnerabilities and how the attackers could take advantage of them. Now, the last part of my talk today is to talk about human being. This is a phrase that are being quoted by many researchers, many experts. They are saying that human being could potentially be the weakest link in our computing system. Now, what do we mean by that? Right? We probably have heard about scam in Singapore. And in fact, today, if I'm not wrong, Straits Times just published the same kind of data for the first half of 2023. And the figures are very similar. So last year, we lost 660 million. In the first half of this year, we lost more than 300 billions already due to the scam happening in Singapore. And the most varying, or I mean, the other varying factor of this part is that it's not just the seniors that is actually falling prey. Many of the young Singaporeans are also victims of these scamming attacks. And I'm sure you have seen something like this in the SMS, right? So, but question is why? Why are we saying that human being could be the weakest link? Here, I'm trying to give you one example. We are calling this so-called the man-in-the-middle attack. And I'm trying to show you that this is a very subtle attack, that it is very difficult to fight against these kind of attacks with our technology. Because when human beings are involved, and if the human being is actually not being careful enough, technology could do very little, right? So here is one example. You can imagine now that you're using one of the computers, the green computer on the left-hand side here, to talk to a web server. Let's say you are doing internet banking, right? So this is so-called the original connection, which is very good. It's in a secure manner. You can establish a very secure connection with a particular bank in Singapore to perform transactions. That is perfectly fine. And our technology enables that and guarantees the integrity and the confidentiality of this communication. But what happens if there is an attacker sitting in the middle? So if the human being, the end user is not careful enough, he go to a particular website which looks very much the same as the intended bank that we want to perform our transaction with. But in fact, it is actually hosted by the attacker. Now, what this attacker is trying to do is he's trying to engage this end user. But at the same time, when he's engaging with the end user, this attacker, also establish a connection with the actual banking server. So in this case, the end user is still eventually talking to the intended bank, but all this communication is now going via the attacker, and the attacker is able to see all this information being sent back and forth between the client and the intended bank server. So you can imagine what this attacker can do, right? Number one thing, he can do is just do eavesdropping, just to do monitoring. He can observe whatever data that you are sending over to the bank, including your username and password in this case. Or he could even do something more sophisticated, right? So for example, the transaction that you're performing here is to do bank transfer, right? It's transferring to, let's say, your loved one's account. But the attacker can potentially see that account number and even change that account number. So you thought that you're dealing with the right bank and transferring to the right person, right account, but the attacker had already modified that account number, and you are actually transferring the money to the attacker's account. So this is something that is very difficult for us to fight against, especially when we think just in terms of the technology. Because in this case, the most vulnerable part is actually the human being, because the human being actually goes to the wrong website. It's not actually the intended bank's website, but actually the attacker's website. Although the appearance of that website looks exactly the same. Now, how can we fight against these kind of attacks? As I mentioned just now, technology is not sufficient, right? We need our end users, we need everybody's effort in order to fight against this. And it is important for everybody to understand some of the technologies, some of the infrastructure that might not be very secure. So here I'm listing a few of them on the left-hand side here. We understand that our telephone system and our SMS system are not operating on a secure infrastructure, in the sense that the caller ID number that we see on our phone is not necessarily correct. They can be forged. The SMS sender information can potentially be forged as well. So when we are looking at this information, we have to think twice. Hey, is this really from the particular sender that we thought that to be? It may not be the case. We also talked about just now on the internet and the networking protocols, right? So source IP address can be forged. Many internet protocols are not secure. So we wish that the general public at least would have some of these understanding so they can think twice before they carry out sensitive transactions on the internet. And this is probably something that you have seen. It's actually from GovTech, right? So potential social engineering attacks that the attackers may use, so-called phishing, so-called email phishing, so-called SMS phishing, right? So they can call you, they can send you email, they can send you SMS, but all these potentially could actually be coming from the attackers. So let's be very careful when we are looking at these emails, the calls, and the SMSs. Okay, so at the end of my talk, I'll just very briefly talk about what can we do, right? So we understand the insecure infrastructure, be it the networking, be it the software, or be it the attackers' strategies that we have in our everyday life, right? So here I'm giving you a few tips. So for example, how do we stay safe when we are using public Wi-Fi? We use public Wi-Fi all the time, be it at the internet cafes, be it at Starbucks, be it at the, let's say, airport lounges. So public Wi-Fi is everywhere. But potentially, the Wi-Fi that you are seeing may actually be hosted or managed by an attacker. So when we're using public Wi-Fi, we have to think twice to see, hey, is it potentially coming from an attacker who is offering this particular Wi-Fi? And if there is any suspicion, the best practice to do is to use a VPN, virtual private network. This is a technology that we can actually establish a secure tunnel between the two endpoints, even if the communication is actually via an insecure Wi-Fi signal. So if you are not aware of this, talk to your system administrator, your company. I'm sure many of the companies and employers in Singapore actually offer VPN access to their employees. So that is one typical advice that we do. Double check HTTPS and SSL, right? So when you are working on your internet browser, please check very carefully that you are using HTTPS and not just HTTP, because HTTPS is the encrypted communication, whereas HTTP is the unencrypted version. Are you expecting that particular Wi-Fi? You may have a Wi-Fi ID saved on your phone. So when you are walking anywhere, it will automatically connect to that particular Wi-Fi. But are you expecting that particular Wi-Fi when you are at that particular location? If not, that could be very suspicious. And there are do's and don'ts, right? So, for example, keep your firewall on and do not just share all the resources that you have on your devices. What about personal devices? All right, we use our mobile phones all the time, right? So how do we keep our personal devices safe? Number one, keep your system updated, right? So make sure you are using the latest operating system, right? So keep updating all your systems. Separate personal from work, right? So don't mix everything together on the same device, because your usage pattern of your personal life could be very different from your work. And the slightly more relaxed way of using your personal device could lead to compromise of data from your work. So separating them would be a good idea. Think twice before installing an app, right? Is that really from a reputable developer, or could it be actually developed by the bad guys? If the app is actually developed by the bad guys, they could potentially gain your private data via the installation of this particular app. Watch out when you are clicking on a link, right? So this applies to email, SMS, for example, in particular, right? It could be invoking a default app on your phone, for example. It could be even installing a new app onto your phone. So before you click on it, make sure you know what that link is about, right? So what do you want to check? You want to check whether where the link is coming from. Is it coming from a reliable source? Or does it actually have the correct domain name, and whether it is actually a HTTP or HTTPS, right? So that is important for you to check. And also do your housekeeping, right? Uninstall unnecessary apps on your phone. Turn off unnecessary services, NFC, Bluetooth, if you're not using them. And also monitor the battery consumption of your apps. If an app is consuming unnecessary battery resources, it could be actually leaking out your sensitive information, right? So these are some of the things that we can do to hopefully better protect our devices. All right, with this, I'm coming to the end of my sharing today, and I just want to let you know that I'm coming from SMU, and I'm coming from School of Computing and Information Systems. And we are offering this Master of IT and Business course in our school. Um, you can see that this is a course that is actually sort of like merging the IT as well as business together so that we know how to best use our IT techniques or resources to benefit our business. So if you're interested, please feel free to look further into the offering that we have. And in fact, I teach in this particular program, and some of these things that I'm sharing today is in fact from some of the courses that we have from this MITB offering here. All right, with this, I am coming to the end of the talk, and I'll be happy to take any questions.